Protein, protein, protein. All you ever hear about is protein. Talk of protein shakes, protein bars, and making the gains has transitioned effortlessly from gym bros to mainstream conversation, and our supermarket shelves are filled with protein foods. And it makes you think that protein is this super important thing for health, for fat loss, and all of those all-important gains. But the question is, do you need an absolute metric fuck ton of it, or can you still build muscle on a relatively low protein diet? Well, that's what this podcast is designed to answer. Now, to answer this question, we're going to delve into some research, but don't worry, my friends. I will make this quick and not boring whatsoever, because no one wants to listen to a recital of scientific psychobabble that really makes no sense to you, right? So let's get started. And of course, I will reference some of these studies. So if you are the geek who wants to go and read these studies, then I will let you know which ones they are so you can do so. Cool, let's get started. Now, thankfully, there is credible research we can call on to answer this question about can we build muscle on a low protein intake? Which, let's face it, when it comes to research, it's not always the case. We don't always have credible evidence available, and we kind of have to smash things together and kind of figure stuff out as we go and kind of make the best guess based on what we know right now. But this is one of the subjects where we do have some decent information. So let's look at Longland et al. 2016. There you go, geeks, go get that. This paper looked at how a large calorie deficit, so we're talking about calorie deficit here, fat loss, and varying protein intakes affected fat mass and muscle mass. Now, these subjects of this particular study were placed in quite a large calorie deficit, 40%, so quite significant calorie deficit. They were either given 1.2 grams per kilo of protein or 2.4 grams per kilo of protein. So we got a low group and we got a high group. Both groups did 6 days of training, a mixture of cardio stuff and some weight training and so on and so forth over the course of a week. So it's quite a hefty training program. And this study lasted for 4 weeks in total. So relatively short, but allows us to draw some conclusions. Now, the key things were both groups lost body fat, although more so in the high protein group. Now, that might be to do with the thermic effect of food. So protein takes more calories in order to digest and absorb, and therefore we have a slightly higher calorie burn with a higher protein diet. Therefore, one advantage outside of muscle gain of a high protein diet. As for those all important gains, well, the high protein group gained about 1.2 kilos of lean body mass on average, which is pretty cool, right? Compared to the low protein group, i.e. the control, who achieved just 0.1 kilos of lean body mass gain. So for me, that's a win for a high protein diet and muscle gain. So if you are someone who is currently in a calorie deficit and you are consuming a low protein diet, your chances of gaining muscle mass are quite small. That's just the long and short of it from that particular study. But let's not stop there. Let's look at Metler et al. 2010. Again, go get it, geeks. This was another study of subjects in a calorie deficit. Also, interestingly, at 40%. These researchers seem to like to put people balls deep in a calorie deficit whenever they study anything. So these poor fellas and ladies. So this time, protein groups differed slightly. So the lower protein group was at 1 gram per kilo, the higher protein group at 2.3 grams per kilo. So this time the results are actually slightly quite different. Now, the low protein group in this study lost muscle. So it would appear, again, whether you want to extrapolate hard and fast conclusions or you just want to kind of just infer that that might be a thing, this would suggest that maybe going below 1.2 and in a calorie deficit where you're going to lose muscle at that point, potentially. I mean, there may be other confounding variables for these particular participants that also influence that. So whether you take that as absolute gospel or just an indication of how you want to manage your nutrition, again, that's up to you. The high protein group also gained, like the previous study did as well, although not to the same extent, smaller gains. So for me, again, it's another win on the high protein approach. But then you say, well, what about if we're not in a calorie deficit? If maybe we're at maintenance or we're trying to be in a small surplus, how do things differ then? Well, there are several studies, probably too many to list, that show the benefit of high protein over low protein diets when we look at hypertrophy, i.e. muscle gain. You could look at Boe et al. 2003, West et al. 2011, Bird et al. 2009, and so on and so on and so on. Go for it, geeks. These studies look at the benefits of protein in a number of different actual ways. So you'll have ones that look at protein timing in terms of like after training and things like that. You'll look at protein frequency and you'll look at total protein intake. And you can look at the amounts of protein that are being consumed within these studies to see what's actually working, what's actually bringing the most amount of muscle gain in these scenarios. But if you're not a geek and you want me to boil all of that down into some semblance of solid information, this is the optimal model for protein intake and muscle gain. This is exactly what I use for myself. I use it for my clients who have a specific focus on muscle gain. And what we do is essentially what you're trying to looking for is 0.3 grams per kilo in the post-workout period. Ideally, whey protein or an equivalent vegan protein. If you have a vegan protein, you might find that you have a little bit more protein in that post-workout period, but let's not go into that. You then want to have 2 to 3 meals, depending on your preference, of mixed protein sources. Now, when I say mixed protein sources, basically have 2 to 3 main meals. Now, your main meal is maybe going to have some lean meat, fish, dairy, is going to have some vegetables, whatever it is. They are all going to have some semblance of protein in it, or obviously there'll be some ingredients that don't, but to all intents and purposes, you're going to get protein from various different sources. Therefore, we want to kind of put protein at about 0.4 to 0.5 grams per kilo for those particular meals. Then ideally, again, if we're being optimal, it depends on when you're having your last meal. But if we wanted to be very, very optimal, we would have what we call a bolus dose, which is kind of like a big one-off dose of protein at about 0.6 grams per kilo just prior to bed. Now, you might say that's beneficial to be casein and stuff like that. I think Bois et al. 1997 or 1996 is the paper that you want to look at for that one. But essentially, that's the optimal way to set up protein intake if you want to build muscle. What that does is it makes sure that we are achieving what we need to achieve in terms of stimulating muscle protein synthesis. And to really simplify this, now this is not the full technical speak of it all. I'm just going to paraphrase what actually happens. So when we want to stimulate muscle protein synthesis and keep in a positive protein balance, what we try to do is hit a leucine threshold. Now, the leucine threshold is going to be that point at which basically it's almost like the key opening the door for muscle gain to begin. And what we do then is those particular doses of protein that I've mentioned help you achieve that. Now, if you are a vegan, sometimes vegan protein sources can be low in leucine, and therefore you would have to think about how to maybe add some additional leucine through supplementation and so on and so forth. But if you're not a vegan and you're having a normal meal that has got maybe some lean meat, dairy, whatever, largely speaking, you don't have to worry about hitting a leucine threshold. So don't overthink it. What we then do is we have this period of time where muscle protein synthesis happens, but it kind of drifts back down to baseline after about 2 or 3 hours. So therefore, what we're doing by having this spaced out approach is when we get back to baseline, we basically then have another protein meal, and that boosts up that muscle protein synthesis again. Body does its thing, comes back to baseline, and then we go again. So these 4 to 6 servings of protein across the course of the day, without really thinking about it, we are creating this optimal environment for muscle gain. Therefore, conversely, if you're having a very low protein diet, your likelihood of having those optimal spikes in muscle protein synthesis are very, very low. And even if you did take a low protein intake and spread it out, probably it's going to be so low that you're not going to hit your leucine threshold to kind of kickstart the process anyway. So for me, low protein diet is not the way to go. Now, obviously, if you have one day where your protein intake is a little bit low, that's not a huge train smash. What we're talking about is what is going to be right consistently over a period of weeks and months and things like that. So that's what we're focusing on there. So that optimal process for looking at your protein is not necessary in order to make gains. You'll make gains doing other things, but you don't kind of have to turn your world upside down, and you're certainly not wasting your time if you're not doing exactly that. Again, it's about figuring out what works for you. And you might be very, very close to that optimal model anyway, because most people have some form of protein shake. It's so popular these days, it's almost like the done thing, right? Have a protein shake post-workout. That, for most people, one scoop of protein, unless you're massively jacked, will probably get you to your 0.3 grams per kilo. Your 2 or 3 main meals, where they're going to be breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and your likelihood is maybe breakfast a bit low in protein for many people, but you can just work on that. But again, most people are having meals with protein in, so you could just check that to see where you are in terms of the volume. And then pre-bed, maybe that's the one that people don't have, but again, it's not hugely essential, it's just optimal. You could have some Greek yogurt or something like that. That's my favorite. Greek yogurt, bit of protein powder, bung in an apple, something like that. Perfect, lovely. But again, that's how to be optimal. You don't have to do that in order to build muscle. So in conclusion, can you build muscle on a low protein diet? Well, maybe a little bit, but it's going to be tough. It's probably unlikely, and you're way better off, no pun intended, of having a higher protein diet.